As a fight fan, you can't help but love a good comeback story, but in equal measure, it's impossible to look away when a fighter's return doesn't exactly go according to plan. This has happened so many times in so many ways that these moments are truly unforgettable, for better or for worse. Today we're going to look into both of those occasions where these returns totally changed the game. I'm ordering this list by how big they were in terms of box office and how memorable they were. So that means it's not necessarily just the biggest sales, but also those indelible memories that came along with them. And frankly, there are just too many good ones to stay at just a top 10. Buckle in, because this is going to be a long one. I'm Jason from MMA On Point, and these are the 15 most memorable returns in MMA history. Number 15, Tank Abbott. When you think about throwback stars in MMA, Tank Abbott fits that description pretty much perfectly. He wasn't exactly the most skilled or the most technical, but to his credit, he was super popular and had earned some very memorable knockouts. But it didn't last that long. After only about 3 years and an awful 8-7 record, Tank took his ball and joined the WCW. He wasn't exactly a splash hit, but still it did keep his name out there, so when Zuffa purchased the nearly bankrupt UFC, they employed some extreme measures as they looked to revive the sport. That's when they started bringing back some of the old stars who were already far past their expiration date to bump up the numbers. This included guys like Tank Abbott and Kimo Leopoldo, and man did they try hyping it up, complete with a totally badass leather jacket, bro, in an old school WWF style warehouse in the background of his hype videos with a way over the top walkout to go along with it. Tank Abbott was set to return, but all the marketing in the world couldn't save him though, as he lost in just 41 seconds to Frank Mir by a toe hold. He'd fight just 2 more times, including a submission loss to the aforementioned Kimo Leopoldo before he moved on to other organizations, and losing again most famously to Kimbo Slice. Number 14, Robbie Lawler. Many forget how long Robbie Lawler has been around. Starting back in 2001, he's just as much a pioneer of the sport as he is one of the most popular stars in the sport today. He was actually the first man to fight on US cable television at UFC 37.5 for a one-off show far before the UFC inked a long-term deal with Fox, or even Spike TV for that matter. Many people remember his fight with Nick Diaz that gained both fighters much attention, as it just so happened to occur on the exact same night as Chuck Liddell finally fighting Tito Ortiz for the first time. But he did end up losing that fight, and again when trying to move up to middleweight for his next fight against the late Evan Tanner. This sent him on a journey through several promotions before getting picked up by Strikeforce, and by the time the UFC bought out the promotion, it looked like perhaps his best days were behind him, as he'd lost 3 of his last 4 fights. Clearly this changed something for him though. After 8 years, he would make his return to the UFC in the welterweight division against Josh Koscheck. And sure enough, Lawler would make short work of him and get the finish brutally by stopping Koscheck in the first round. There was some controversy with some calling it an early stoppage, but it definitely wasn't a fluke. He ended up becoming champion in the incredibly stacked division and had 2 of the best title fights in MMA history against Rory McDonald and Carlos Condit. Number 13, Mark Kerr. At one time, Mark Kerr was the undefeated 11-0 uncrowned baddest man on the planet. He'd won a tournament with World Vale Tudo Championships and 2 with UFC 14 and UFC 15 respectively in the heavyweight division. Not only was he massive in the unregulated PED era and an incredibly strong wrestler, but he was also great with submissions. And he's the only guy to my knowledge to have ever won a UFC tournament with a chin to the eye submission. Of course, he knew conventional submissions too, even beating Josh Barnett in an ADCC tournament in 2000 with a Kimura. But that all came crashing down as HBO documented his rise and fall beautifully in the smashing machine that witnessed his addiction to painkillers and troubled personal life take control of him. This led to some memorable losses like the insane Fujita loss that saw him expel all of his energy and freeze up on the ground, then his rematch loss to Igor Vovchanchyn, and again by brutal knees to Heath Herring that sent him on a 3-year hiatus. When he came back, fans hoped to see the time off renew his vigor for competition, but it was immediately apparent we weren't even looking at the same man, and in upsetting fashion while going for a takedown, KERR actually knocked himself out by hitting his head on the canvas. He'd fight 9 more times after this, but he'd only win twice more before retiring in 2009. Number 12, FEDOR EMELIANENKO. After setting the world on fire with a nearly 10-year undefeated streak in Pride and later on against former UFC champions, there was no better talent in MMA, including the UFC. So that's why it was so shocking when the loss finally came in 2010 to Fabricio Werdum. The world was stunned, and after 2 more losses to Bigfoot Silva and Dan Henderson, FEDOR closed out his career on a high note with 3 low-profile wins in 2012. He was moving on to a political life in Russia, and it felt like the right time to many for him to hang up the gloves for good. But sure enough, as it does for many fighters, the fight game was just too alluring to stay away from, as FEDOR began openly talking about a return in 2015. And so at Bellator Dynamite 1, he appeared with none other than Pride former president Sakiki Bara to announce his return to MMA. And on that night, he didn't announce an opponent, but did announce he would be fighting in Japan for a special New Year's Eve show, just like the old Pride days. So fans were excited to hear he was back, and speculation was rampant on who he might fight. But then a couple of weeks later, famed MMA journalist Ariel Helwani announced who he was fighting: Jadeep Singh. I don't even know if I'm saying that right, to be honest. He was a fighter who only had 1 win when this was announced. Fans were less than pleased with such a lackluster opponent, and sure enough, he dispatched of him in 3 minutes into round 1. If the opponent were any more formidable or well known, this easily could have ranked much higher, but it certainly took things down a few notches. Number 11, Anderson Silva. Speaking of who many consider the greatest of all time, here is another of the pound for pound GOAT contenders, Anderson Silva. After dominating the UFC middleweight division from 2006 to 2013 and losing by a wild KO to Chris Weidman, Silva was back for redemption at the close of the year to face Weidman once more as the title was on the line again. But in perhaps the most insane turn of events, the fight would end by a graphic warning: 3, 2, 1, you've been warned. Stomach-turning leg kick that many thought could have even been the end of his career. So when it was announced that just over a year later that at UFC 183 he'd not only be returning, but having a dream fight with Nick Diaz, the MMA world could not have been more excited. Unfortunately though, aside from some amazing moments from Diaz clowning Anderson in highly entertaining ways, the fight itself was a bit of a dud, which Anderson won by decision. What made this even more memorable though was the fact that Silva failed his pre-fight drug test, pre-USADA mind you, with 2 anabolic steroids in his system. Subsequently, his win over Diaz was overturned to a no contest. His defense? An off-brand sexual enhancement drug that led to the most bizarre and hilarious hearing with the Nevada State Athletic Commission. A circus where fans somehow figured out a way to call into the hearings and make this happen.
Actually use that.
Pat Lundvall was unimpressed and his defense was rejected. Number 10, Wanderlei Silva. By the time Wanderlei Silva had finally made his way to the UFC, his career was already the stuff of legend. He held the most wins in Pride history with 22, the longest undefeated streak with 20 wins, the most knockouts with 15, and the most finishes overall in a tie with Mirko Cro Cop with 16 each. On top of that, he ruled the Pride middleweight division from 2001 to 2006 and even won a tournament that included Chuck Liddell, Alistair Overeem, Sakuraba, and Rampage Jackson. Unfortunately though, by the time he came to the UFC, he had already suffered 2 incredibly brutal knockout cold losses to Cro Cop and Dan Henderson that would start a downturn in his career he would never recover from. Needless to say, he was one of the most recognizable athletes in the sport. And he could already make this list with an incredible fight he'd end up losing to Chuck Liddell in one of the best fights in MMA history that marked his first fight returning to the UFC after 7 years. But it was after his fight with Rich Franklin that he announced a short layoff for some much needed surgeries. What kind of surgeries, you ask? Well, just in case you question his dedication to the sport, he finally repaired his nose that he'd broken repeatedly since the second Cro Cop fight, causing sleep apnea, and specifically got scar tissue removed from his eyes so they wouldn't actually bleed easily during his fights. The result? I'll let Joe Rogan sum it up.
And if you're an old fan of Wanderlei Silva, you can really see the difference in the look on his face. I mean, he looks like a totally different human.
It's by far the shortest time on this list, away with only 8 months, but as he returned that night to fight Michael Bisping, infamous is only one of many ways you could put it. Number 9, Cain Velasquez. Peak condition Cain Velasquez is considered by many to be the greatest heavyweight of all time. Fedor has even mentioned him many times to be one of the best in the sport from his view.
Scott Coker just said you're the best fighter ever. Many people agree with that.
Coker сказал,
What
что
do you say is the best fighter ever?
Well, I liked really very much Cain Velasquez, but he's not fighting nowadays, I guess.
After he closed out the amazing trilogy with JDS, a dominant fighter in his own right and undefeated man prior to their trilogy, many questioned who could possibly challenge Cain for the title and offer him any real competition after that. What just so happened to be that the man who also beat Fedor, Fabricio Werdum, had crossed over to the UFC after the Strikeforce acquisition and had amassed an impressive 4-fight win streak as the clear new challenger. But a now all too familiar string of injuries happened as they have plagued the latter half of his career, in which Werdum won the interim title against Mark Hunt while he was out when they were originally supposed to fight at UFC 180. So after nearly 2 years away, Velasquez was set to return against Werdum at UFC 188 in Mexico City for the undisputed crown. In an absolute role reversal of all reversals, the man called Cardio Cain became noticeably fatigued and by the third round became an easy target for Werdum to pick apart, which he easily did first on the feet and then ended up catching Cain in a guillotine while going for a takedown. As it's well known now, the high elevation of Mexico City was the tragic flaw for Cain in his preparation. While Werdum spent around a month acclimating to the conditions, Velasquez reportedly only spent about a week in the environment that turned out to be his downfall. Credit to Werdum as well, but that clearly wasn't the best version of Cain. Number 8, Nick Diaz. One of the most popular fighters in MMA history that is sometimes lost on new fans, I think, because he hasn't fought since 2015, and now those that have started watching since then only know his brother. But if you remember watching him back in the day, he was just a massive star and still is despite the inactivity. And as mentioned earlier, he became a huge star fighting ROBBIE LAWLER with his breakout performance at UFC 47. The rest of his early UFC career was a bit hit and miss, and he eventually found himself also in Strikeforce. Unlike Lawler though, he became the king of the welterweight division in the organization, and by the time the UFC acquired Strikeforce, he was on an impressive 10-fight win streak. And during this time, he became sort of an anti-hero. He wasn't showing up to press conferences in a suit, had threatened reporters.
Do you not like me, Nick?
I feel like you instigate fights quite a bit, but you know, that's...
Fights between the fighters?
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's your job, but where I come from, you know, people like that get slapped.
And certainly wasn't there to be a role model. What he was there to do was put on incredible fights and box the hell out of his opponents or submit them. It was a no-brainer decision for the UFC to pluck him out of Strikeforce before they closed it and immediately booked him in a match champion versus champion against George St-Pierre. So on the day of the highly anticipated first press conference between the two, Diaz was absent. He would later post a video going after the UFC in the intense press schedule saying that he missed his flight while criticizing them for kicking him off the card for missing the presser. So it was already a memorable occasion for his return back to the UFC in 5 years. So as a result of all this, he was then booked against BJ Penn, and instead Carlos Condit would get the title shot. Bizarrely though, St-Pierre would end up suffering an injury, and as a result, Diaz would end up headlining the card despite everything, and he ended up fighting BJ Penn where he'd win by decision. It was a memorable circumstance and incredible return performance to the UFC against BJ, and who could forget his legendary call out after the fight.
I don't think George is hurt. I think he's scared. I think he's scared to fight everybody right now. What's up? Where you at, George?
Number 7, Brock Lesnar. At UFC 199, just 1 month away from UFC 200, the UFC played a promo trailer for 200 that was good in its own way, promoting the stat card that then still featured Jones versus Cormier 2 before the ill-fated drug test took Jones off the card. While we all focused on that being hyped up, the trailer seemingly ended, but then...
Can you see me now? Can you see me now?
Joe Rogan's reaction here pretty much summed it up for the rest of us watching at home.
What does that mean? Is that real?
That's real.
Here was Brock Lesnar, out of nowhere fighting at UFC 200. For many, the question wasn't just who, but also how, especially when you consider he was supposed to be in the USADA testing pool for 6 months prior to even be eligible. But a controversial beyond controversial loophole was exploited because he was technically retired, which allowed him to be exempt from pre-testing. It personally doesn't really make any sense to me, and neither did it to anybody else, but either way, he was able to begin pre-fight testing like normal as a result of it. He would go on to win the fight, but that was quickly overturned to a no contest because, surprise, surprise, he ended up actually failing his pre-fight drug tests. Twice. And you want to know what his defense was? Foot cream. I don't think so, Brock. Either way though, it was probably that fight that saved the card in terms of pay-per-view buys, since Jones popped as well before the fight and was ineligible to compete. So this return was memorable in that sense, in addition to the sudden announcement of his return. And there's of course the legal battle Mark Hunt filed after his loss that he's still fighting against the UFC today. Number 6, Dominick Cruz. Dominick Cruz is one of my favorite all-time fighters, and he's definitely in my top 5. And this is honestly my personal number 1 for the list, but I have to be fair, and memorable has to be weighted heavily on star power and sheer number of people who, well, will remember it. He's certainly not as big a box office star as Brock, but how incredible this return is can't be ignored and deserves to be ranked so highly. At this point, he had only one loss in his career in 2007 to Uriah Faber, and had since avenged that loss in 2011. He was on a 10-fight win streak, and 5 of those wins were title fights that also happened to include Demetrius Johnson. He was so dominant and on a high note going into the first and only live season The Ultimate Fighter ever back in 2012, where he was scheduled to fight Uriah Faber again in a high-profile grudge match to close out their rivalry. But as fate would have it, he'd suffer one of the worst injuries an athlete can have, and that was a torn ACL. On the shorter end, this would sideline him for at least a year. But by the end of 2012, Cruz's body actually rejected the cadaver ACL he was given. So this meant he was sidelined again. Fast forward to February 1st, 2014, he was scheduled to return against the interim champion while he was out, Renan Barão. Unfortunately, this was a fight we never get to see because that fell apart when Cruz tore his groin ahead of that fight. Finally, after 2 years out, the UFC stripped him of his title and named Barão the undisputed champion. But somehow Cruz pulled through and returned again against Takeya Mizugaki in a fight that he resoundingly earned by KO in round 1. It was thought his dark days were finally past him, but this was short-lived because just after being promised the title shot against the man to dethrone Barão in his absence, TJ Dillashaw, life was especially cruel to him as he tore the ACL in his other knee, meaning this would now be the 3rd time he'd have this surgery done. It blows my mind he didn't retire through all of this, considering he was and is such a great analyst who could live easily off of that life. But miraculously, he pulled through, and finally on January 17th, 2016, Dominick Cruz challenged TJ Dillashaw for the title he never lost, and even more astounding was that he won the split decision despite suffering a new injury through the last couple of rounds of the fight with plantar fascia tendonitis that he'd been dealing with before the fight. It's a story you couldn't have written better if you tried, and his return is one of my personal favorite fights to watch in MMA history. It's just that good. Number 5, Randy Couture. Unlike many of the other entries on this list, Couture actually has 2 awe-inspiring returns. After upsetting the odds on 3 separate occasions, one by being an unknown winning the UFC 13 heavyweight tournament, then later flipping the world on its head by beating the unbeatable looking young phenom Vitor Belfort, and then again gaining the heavyweight title from Maurice Smith. Couture had quickly established himself in just 4 career fights as one of the very best in the sport. This would be cast into doubt though, as he would lose twice after vacating the UFC title and fighting in Japan. But he would regain momentum shortly after with 2 more wins before returning to the UFC after 3 years off and competing against the much bigger and younger wrestler in Kevin Randleman when he was already 37 years old. It was another fight people just assumed he would lose, that he actually ended up dominating himself and turned the tables to stop Randleman in the 3rd round by using his own ground and pound tactics against it. I know, memorable already, but fast forward past capturing the title from Chuck Liddell at light heavyweight, but then eventually losing to him twice, the last at age 42, it made all the sense in the world for him to retire after another devastating knockout loss. So nearly a year had gone by and the world was prepared to move on, but that's when Couture suddenly announced that he was not only returning, but would be at heavyweight and he'd be facing Tim Sylvia, the 6'8" reigning champion who was barely 30 by the time they'd fight, and Couture was 43. It was a fight Couture was sure to lose, but just as legendary as his career was all throughout all the upsets stemming back to May 30th, 1997 when he debuted at UFC 13, Couture not only won the fight by unanimous decision, but almost knocked out Sylvia and submitted him immediately in the 1st round. It's just one of the many reasons Randy Couture will forever be one of the most revered athletes and pioneers of the sport. Number 4, George St-Pierre. With 9 consecutive title defenses and 13 overall in one of the most stacked divisions, perhaps only second to 155 pounds, it's beyond impressive what he accomplished. But his last win was a controversial one over Johnny Hendricks, and when he said he was taking time away from the sport, there was plenty of reason to believe it spelled retirement. But many hoped he would come back, and although it was a long time off with strange negotiation tactics played out in the public by Dana White claiming he wasn't a fighter anymore, and on again, off again booking against middleweight champion Michael Bisping, it was finally settled that he challenged Bisping for his title at UFC 217 and Madison Square Garden. The booking in return was huge, but there was a ton of doubts, many of it stemming from his extended time off from competition, moving up in weight for the first time, and he didn't look so good in many of what fans saw of him leading up to the fight in his camp. At the time, it looked like he was just kind of out of shape after the layoff, but no one knew he was battling ulcerative colitis at the time, which is an intestinal disorder that severely affected his fight camp leading up to it. As GSP said himself, they were very close to pulling out of the fight because of that. Luckily, this all seemed to turn around just in time, and as rarely happens in MMA today, the 3 biggest fights on the card all stayed intact. After an incredible night of fights, GSP proved to be the showstopper, and despite some trouble in the second round, he recovered in spectacular fashion, finishing the champion in round 3 by rear naked choke. It was a stunning return that showed just how talented GSP still was, and that he might have even improved during his time off. Number 3, Ronda Rousey. Back in her day, there was perhaps no bigger star the sport had ever seen. In fact, she broke 1 million pay-per-view buys before Conor did his first time in 2015, with UFC 189 falling just shy of that distinction. In that same year, she was the 3rd most Googled person in the entire world. If I'm being honest, I think the backlash she's gotten has been well deserved for her own behavior in terms of totally shutting out the sport and blaming fans plus media for many of her own issues. But whether you personally like her or not doesn't make her record invalid. That doesn't matter. Cat Zingano is the last person to beat the current champion as of this recording, Amanda Nunes, and Ronda beat her in just 14 seconds. If you dislike someone, you don't have to discredit every element of their existence, and that's what I think a lot of fans try to unfairly do with her record. What was exposed, though, was of course her loss to Holly Holm that was so dominant and so definitive that everyone realized how bad her striking on the feet really was. Perhaps previous opponents just gave her much too much respect based on how big she was back then. And again, discussing the underrated strength of Ronda's record, the woman she defeated twice definitively by armbar, one gruesomely, Miesha Tate, beat Holly Holm in her absence. This was a night that solidified the rear naked choke as a brutal finisher in fans' minds forever. But then Miesha Tate got completely dominated herself by Amanda Nunes at UFC 200. So when Ronda was ready to return, it was just over a year after her loss at UFC 207. It was indeed a huge question of whether Ronda had a chance against another brutal striker. That question couldn't have been answered more resoundingly, as Ronda was frankly nothing more than a punching bag in that fight, and her career came crashing down in that same instant. So this was memorable not just because of how big she was, but also the way the UFC mishandled the promotion. In the build-up, the UFC lent almost no time to Amanda Nunes and focused solely on Rousey's return. Because of it, I believe it's the reason neither then nor now do fans even really know who Nunes is. On top of this, Rousey did absolutely no press in terms of traditional press conferences or media. This is notable because it even got Conor McGregor kicked off of UFC 200 for refusing media. It's a shame how it all went down, and with just a bit more humility on her part, perhaps she'd be remembered better by MMA fans. But it's a tragic end to her career and title reign that won't soon be forgotten. Number 2, Conor McGregor. With the high-profile entry of Ronda's loss and this new one too with McGregor, you can't help but draw comparisons between the two. This one though took place on the biggest stage by far. In October 2018, estimates for pay-per-view sales are currently listed at about 2.4 million. An absolutely shattering achievement in comparison to the previous record of 1.65 million buys by Conor and Nate Diaz held 2 years earlier at UFC 202. Conor would capture the lightweight title just a couple of months later at UFC 205 against Eddie Alvarez, making him the first two-weight world champion, which if I'm being honest is a bit of a bullshit distinction. The only two people to do this in history are the two belts he held and the two Daniel Cormier held. Conor McGregor was stripped of his first belt less than a month after winning the second one, and Cormier is said to be getting stripped of his when Jones faces Gustafsson at UFC 232. In my opinion, they basically just traded out one title for the other since neither actually defended the first one. Either way, when Conor was finally ready to come back after his insane one-off boxing fight with Floyd Mayweather, he decided to do it in a rather disgraceful way. In response to a confrontation Khabib Nurmagomedov had with Conor's teammate Artem Lobov, Conor flew to New York during Khabib's UFC 223 press obligations and attacked the bus he was on, demanding a fight. Instead of getting a fight though, he needlessly injured fighters and got them medically pulled from their fights that weekend, something he is facing lawsuits for still to this day. But the UFC didn't punish him at all, and in fact they used it for promotion for UFC 229 when the two were set to settle their issues in the cage. In the promotion, Conor took things even further, attacking Khabib's family, his way of life, and personal connections that have so many far-reaching implications I'm not fully prepared to fit it into just one small entry. Trust me, I've made a 30-minute video about that. But anyhow, this all culminated in McGregor losing emphatically in a one-sided title fight that Khabib dominated from the opening bell, with little success from McGregor at all. And pretty much right after this was when the melee outside occurred, and then subsequently inside the cage as well. On this channel we talked a lot about how big the numbers were heading into their fight, but the fallout of this was way bigger, with the post-fight press conference dwarfing the pre-fight ones. It's a main event that will certainly live in infamy for its disgraceful build-up with Conor and reciprocal finish with Khabib. Number 1, Ken Shamrock. Where do you even go after a mess like UFC 229? Well, you certainly don't go any bigger in terms of sales. You go historical. And while Shamrock isn't known for necessarily having the greatest return in terms of success, it perhaps is the most important one that laid the foundation for every fight that happens in the UFC today. What you can never take away from Shamrock is his place in history. He was fighting in Japan for Pancrase just before the UFC began, and he fought at UFC 1 as one of the sport's two first stars alongside Royce Gracie, where he'd actually lose to Gracie in the semifinals. That began the first UFC rivalry as well. In the early days, he held wins over Funaki twice, Matt Hume, Bas Rutten twice, Murray Smith, Dan Severn, and Kimo Leopoldo before moving on to WWF for a few years. And although I'm not a fan of pro wrestling, there is no doubting it did a tremendous amount to raise his profile while he was on hiatus from MMA. And one of the biggest precursors to his return would be after Tito Ortiz beat Guy Metzger in 1999 for their rematch. He celebrated by wearing a t-shirt calling Metzger his bitch, setting off Ken Shamrock, who was in the corner that night. Before their fight would take place though, Ken Shamrock would first make his debut in Pride after 4 years off from the sport. His first fight back wasn't the most thrilling matchup against Alexander Otsuka, but he did have an incredible fight with Don Frye that's one of the absolute best in Pride in MMA history. But the fight that everyone wanted to see was the Tito Ortiz fight. By 2002, Tito was far and away the biggest star of the promotion. And it couldn't have worked out any better that he and the now more popular than ever Ken Shamrock absolutely hated each other. It was a fight that the then fledgling UFC and its still new owners and the Fertittas were all too aware of and were ready to capitalize on. So it finally happened after 6 years away from the UFC. He made his return to challenge for Tito's light heavyweight title. At the time, it was an unprecedented level of attention and press in the dark ages of MMA in America. When it was all said and done, Tito was able to dominate the fight, although Ken did show a great deal of heart, but Prime Tito was on top of his game at that moment in time. The pay-per-view sold a measly 100,000 buys by today's standards, but it was a new record for Zuffa's UFC at the time, and although it wasn't the game changer The Ultimate Fighter was a couple of years later, it was certainly an island of success in an era of drowning debt that perhaps if that didn't take place, we might not even be looking at the UFC today.
I believe we can predict the future of this wild sport.
I saw it. Like, I don't know, I saw it.
We take pride in spotting prospects early in their career and sit back smugly whilst they go on to achieve the sporting heights you foresaw all those years ago. However, with the margin for error so small in MMA, career paths often take unexpected turns for the worse.